The Masculine Mask and Emotional Suppression. Welcome to Shame, Self-Abandonment, and the Pornography Trap. I'm Dr. Chuck, and in this episode we're turning our attention to what I call the masculine mask. The learned behavior patterns, emotional suppressions, and silent agreements that men adopt to survive in a world that has little tolerance for masculine vulnerability. Our last episode laid the developmental groundwork for how shame is formed in boyhood, and today's conversation explores how that shame becomes behaviorally encoded in male identity. We're going to unpack the following 5 topics: why men disconnect from their emotional world, the social scripts that enforce emotional suppression, the emergence of normative male alexithymia, which is emotional blindness, how performance-based masculinity replaces emotional honesty, and how that mask eventually cracks through failures, exposure, or isolation. Let's begin with the heart of the matter. What happens when a man's inner world is never given language? Most boys are not told explicitly, don't feel. What they're told are, be strong. Big boys don't cry. Shake it off. You're being too sensitive. You need to toughen up. Each of these phrases sends a message. And when they're repeated often enough by parents or coaches, teachers, peers, even pastors, they form a shame-based belief system that emotional needs are liabilities. By the time a boy reaches adolescence, most of them have already internalized the idea that showing fear or sadness or neediness equals weakness. Many learn to present a limited emotional palette to the world. Usually, they're able to safely present anger, humor, or silence. This is not just personality style, it is a survival adaptation. They don't suppress emotion because they're unemotional. They suppress emotion because emotional expression was punished or socially shunned or relationally suppressed or even spiritually pushed back. Think about back in the 60s, the old TV show Star Trek, when you had the Vulcans. The idea behind a Vulcan was they had emotion, but because of the violence of their world, they learned to repress it, push it down, and not express the emotion. They had it, but it was simmering below the surface, and they held themselves in check. And they saw that as a higher level of being, and they turned to logic instead. It seemed to amplify the control of emotion as being the better path. That's kind of what it's like to be a man in our culture. We're not allowed to have feelings other than the ones that are manly, such as being angry or humorous or stoic. These patterns aren't accidental. They're actually reinforced by the culture that scripts masculinity into very narrow terms. Psychologists have referred to this as the man box, the set of rules, spoken and unspoken, that define what it means to be a real man. Real men are strong. Real men are providers. Real men don't cry. Real men are in control of their emotions, their women, and their circumstances. When you step outside of that box, you're met with some shame policing, sometimes overt, sometimes subtle. The phrase man up is not a call to maturity, it's a shaming command to hide your neediness. And here's the cruel irony. The more pressure men feel to live up to this false ideal, the more they begin to detach from their true selves. They build a persona of competence and cool-headed strength, but inside they feel anxious, inadequate, or numb. That detachment from self is what we'll later call self-abandonment. And it begins not in addiction, but in emotional suppression. An example might be when a boy enters into middle school. Now, if you remember back into middle school, if you're a man, middle school is typically 6th, 7th, 8th grade, right in that range. It's at that point that boys hit puberty and their bodies start to develop. The difference between a 6th grader and a 9th grader can be tremendously different. Whether you're in the 6th grade or the 8th grade, you might be far into puberty or just starting. It's hard to know because boys start puberty sometime in that 3-year period. But I remember back in middle school, that's when we all started taking gym class. That's the first time that all the boys are put into a room, told to change their clothes, exercise, and then go take a shower, and in those days, a group shower. You had to get naked in front of a whole bunch of boys. Now, boys being what they are, like to pick on the other kids. They like to criticize. They find any weakness. So you would have boys who hadn't started puberty, and you had other boys that looked like they'd been in puberty for about 16 years. And so obviously the more mature boys would pick on the less mature boys. And there was a big hierarchy. But you were not allowed to show shame because that would show weakness. So what would happen is the boys instinctively knew you can't show this weakness. So you would have to get naked, walk to the shower, take a shower, regardless of your developmental state, in front of all these boys who you knew were going to look at you, judge you, and possibly pick on you. But you had to do it in such a way that you didn't show any shame or any fear, that you didn't care. Of course you did care, because it didn't matter who you were. Chances were there's going to be somebody who was more physically mature than you. And so you weren't going to measure up to everybody, and you knew it. And as a man, or as a boy, you were insecure about not being able to be adequate or measure up, but you couldn't show it. So you pretended. You put on a facade. If someone joked you, you just laughed about it. You pretended. I remember those days. That was a difficult time. Walking naked in a group of 40 or 50 people, absolutely naked to the world, being judged, and pretending I didn't care. See, that's where you detach from yourself. It's actually a way of dissociating from reality. That is a self-abandonment. This is how men live their lives. A lot of women don't recognize this. Men live their lives like this every day. They are standing naked in the world, pretending nothing bothers them. Researchers like Ronald Levant and James Mahalik have documented a phenomenon about emotional blindness. It's something that's taught to men. We're trained not to pay attention to our emotions. We're trained not to acknowledge them. We're not encouraged to understand them. So it creates this normative male alexithymia, which technically is a difficulty in identifying and expressing emotions. But I like the term emotional blindness, because it's not just a difficulty. A lot of men can't see what they're feeling. They can't define it because they don't understand it. They're literally blind to what's going on. Yeah, they're not happy. Yeah, they're frustrated. Yeah, they're mad, but they can't tell you they're disappointed, or they're embarrassed, or they're maybe crestfallen or betrayed or something of that nature. Women have about 300 words that they use for emotions. Men have maybe 6. This isn't pathology. This isn't something broken in the man's brain. This is conditioning. If a boy is never taught to name his feelings, in most cases he's told to stop having them because feelings are unsafe or unwelcome or seen as feminine, then his emotional vocabulary will remain very stunted. In the counseling office, we use prompts, helps. I have feelings cards, I have feelings charts, and I have a feelings wheel. The feelings wheel is one of my favorites. In the middle, there are 6 feelings. There's happy, sad, disgust, surprise, fear, and anger. Those are primary feelings. And then on a circle around that, they extend out. So for instance, for sad, you might have guilty, abandoned, despair, depressed, lonely, bored. Go out one more level, and you can extend sad out to remorseful, ashamed, ignored, victimized, powerless, etc. You see, women can take their feelings and go to those nuanced levels. Men can't. So they might just say, I'm sad. And everything gets subsumed into that. It's all part of sad. And that's good enough for them. They probably won't even want to tell you they're sad because that looks weak. What do you have to be sad about? So they remain very stunted because their vocabulary is very limited. If you have a limited vocabulary, you can't relate. It's like going to a foreign country and not knowing any words in that. I went to a Spanish-speaking country once, and all I could remember from high school is how to count to 10 and how to say yes and no and please and thank you. And that was about it. It was very difficult to navigate in that culture. By adulthood, many men can't distinguish between anger and sadness. They struggle to explain why they feel anxious or lost. They default to problem solving instead of being present. Women will tell you this. When they try to explain how they feel about something that they've experienced to the men immediately go to problem solving. They say, well, you should just do this thing or that thing. They try to fix it. Because that's what men do. When they have a feeling, they fix it. They want the feeling to go away as quickly as possible. So they try to fix it. So when you share your feeling with a man, his instinct is, well, let me fix it for you so you can stop feeling that horrible thing. Because men think you want to get rid of the feeling as bad as they do. Or they go silent. feeling paralyzed by the emotional intensity. So if a man is sitting there doing nothing, being silent, it's probably because he doesn't like how he's feeling. He's waiting for the feeling to go away. And a lot of their wives come and say, what are you feeling? I'm nothing. Well, you must be feeling something. No, I'm not. You look sad. I'm fine. And they don't want to talk about it because they're waiting for the feeling to go away. And every time she asks them, what are you feeling? Or talk to me about it, it makes the feeling come back and he gets upset. In therapy, I often see this when a man is staring blankly at me after I ask, how does that make you feel? Not because he's being evasive, but because he genuinely doesn't know how it makes him feel. And he's never been allowed to learn. This emotional illiteracy leaves men vulnerable to addictive coping because they cannot metabolize internal distress in healthy ways. So instead, they turn to control, performance, escape, or distraction, which pornography conveniently provides. Let's talk about performance-based masculinity here. Many men define themselves by what they do, not who they are. If you go into a group and two men meet each other for the first time, they usually exchange their names and they say, well, what do you do? I'm an investment advisor. I'm a doctor. I'm an Uber driver. And they tell you what they do. They don't tell you who they are. Or if they do tell you who they are, they tell you who they are in terms of performance. I'm a provider. I get results. I lead my family. I stay composed. These are not inherently bad roles, but when a man's identity is tethered entirely to performance, then failure becomes existential. In other words, when he doesn't perform the way he wants to be seen, something inside of him is a failure. If the project flops, the business fails, the marriage struggles, the kids act out, or he loses his job, it's not just dealing with circumstances anymore. Now he's wrestling with an identity collapse. That's because the mask of doing has eclipsed the presence of being. He's become a human doing. He's no longer a human being. This is how we raise boys. We stop them from being themselves, and we teach them how to do masculinity. And the tragic consequence, the more men perform their identity, the more isolated they become. They may be admired, they may be respected, even envied, but they are not known. And deep down, they know it too. There was a video, I think it was on the Michael Knowles podcast, of a woman who was a trans man. She was a woman who thought she was a man, or pretending to be a man, or trying to transition to be a man, however you want to say it. And she lived for a year as a man in the man's world. And she was dressed like a man, and she had it was a TikTok video of herself, and she was breaking down sobbing. She says it was terrible to be a man. She was so lonely. Men don't connect. They don't talk. She couldn't connect with anybody. There was no relationship. She doesn't know how men do it. It was just so lonely. And she was sobbing about this disconnection, this feeling forlorn and lonely, and just it was how awful it was. And all the guys, I showed this to a bunch of guys in the group. It's like, duh, because men don't connect. We're not safe when we connect. It's not safe to fail. It's not safe to feel. It's not safe to be weak, not in the man's world, not even in front of God. So we wear our mask until it cracks. At some point in life, though, it does crack. Life breaks through. It always does. You're going to lose a job. There's going to be a moral failure, a panic attack, a betrayed wife, a secret exposed. Suddenly the mask isn't enough, and you are left naked and exposed like a locker room in the 8th grade, emotionally unequipped and shame-ridden. This is when many men spiral, not because they're fragile, but because their strength was built on suppression, not integration. They collapse. The collapse feels total. I'm a fraud. I've let everyone down. I'll never be enough. If they knew who I was, they'd leave me. I can never fix this. It's not just shame. It's shame upon shame upon shame. And it often sends men further into secrecy, self-attacking, or coping strategies, especially with pornography and other types of fantasies, gaming, adultery, things like that. These offer false intimacy without the risk of vulnerability. But every click deepens the wound. Every text deepens the wound. Not just because of what it does, but because of what it reinforces. It says you are only acceptable when you're performing. You're only loved when you're hiding. So how do we break this? How do we help men remove the mask? Not by shaming their shame, but by meeting it with truth and presence. It begins with naming the scripts. We must help men see that the rules they've been living by are not truth. They're trauma responses in disguise. Then we reintroduce the emotional self, not in therapeutic jargon, but in human language. What did that feel like? What were you needing? What did that part of you want to say? Men don't need to become emotional performers. They need to become emotionally present. And that begins when we tell them the truth. You're allowed to feel. You're allowed to be weak. And you're allowed to be real. In the next episode, we'll examine pornography use as a shame coping strategy, not simply a moral failure, but a trauma-informed behavior that offers momentary relief while reinforcing disconnection, self-loathing, and relational sabotage. We'll explore why men use porn not just for pleasure, but for numbing, control, and emotional escape, and why recovery is not about behavior management, but identity restoration. Thank you for listening to Shame, Self-Abandonment, and the Pornography Trap. If you're finding this helpful, please subscribe, share, or bring it into your conversations with others, and let's help restore men, not just to sobriety, but to strength. I'm Dr. Chuck, and until next time, be blessed.